Okay. Okay. Thank you everyone for coming to the publishing session today. And thank you to our two speakers, Peter Barr-Gillespie and Dr. Ronna Hertzano. Today's session, as with all virtual mentoring sessions, will be recorded and posted on the ARO YouTube page for later viewing. Don't forget to join us on Monday the 8th for our other mentoring sessions that haven't happened yet. Mentor-mentee communication will be in the morning, and then work-life balance is going to be in the afternoon. Closed captioning will be taking place live during this session. You'll find the live closed captioning at the bottom of your screen, as Zoom provides an AI-powered live transcription that needs to be enabled by the viewer by clicking the closed captioning button and enabling auto transcription. Please direct any questions through the chat function to me, the moderator, or you can maybe hit your reaction, like raise your hand button. There's not too many people here. I don't think we'll get overwhelmed. So we can get on with learning about publishing from Dr. Peter Barr-Gillespie, who's the Chief Research Officer at Oregon Health and Science University. He's had many publications in high impact journals and over 10,000 citations. And Dr. Ronna Hertzano, who as of 2023 assumed the role of a chief of a newly established neuroodology sorry, branch of the NIDCD. And she maintains her adjunct position as a clinical professor at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. She's established the GEAR portal to help data sharing and visualization among hearing researchers. And she's had loads of publications and thousands of citations as well. So if you guys want to get started by introducing yourselves, however you see fit, and maybe giving us your philosophy on publishing and like maybe new grad students and trainees, how like they should maybe view publishing.
Ronna, do you want to go first?
Sure. So my name is Ronna Hertzano. Thank you for having me here. I'm a surgeon scientist, and as you said, I recently accepted a position at the NIDCD as the chief for neurotology. This is a branch that its goal is to promote translational studies to cure hearing loss, essentially, or disease associated with the ear. The question of publishing is a tough one. It has so many facets, so it's going to be an interesting discussion, and looking forward to questions to guide it. There are questions always about, when is it time to publish, who should publish, and so on and so forth. But maybe before I dive into that, which I think would be better at the conversation, we'll have Peter introduce.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ronna. So I'm Peter Barr-Gillespie. As Kate said, I'm Chief Research Officer at OHSU, which means I have a big administrative load. But, frankly, running my research program, which I still do, is what gets me up in the morning and keeps me engaged in the bigger work as well. And I have had a research program on how hair cell transduction and hair bundle function work for the last however many years it's been, 30 plus years, and really have enjoyed having that as a career over this time. I think just like grant writing and grant getting, publishing has its definite ups and downs as you go along in your career, as some papers you think are wonderful and the reviewers don't agree, and you end up with a lot of challenges in getting a project published, and then other ones, maybe you target better to the right journal and go through more smoothly. So I'm happy to, to have a deeper conversation about that. But I think my philosophy over time has shifted. But now I think I have the luxury now because of the advanced state of my career, if you will, of choosing a journal that just seems like the right journal for a story rather than trying to get a paper published in the highest profile journal possible. It is easier for sure to target a project appropriately. But again, we can talk about that more as the time goes on.
Okay, maybe we can start with the question and build on that of like picking the right journal for your career stage and your project.
I'll start off on that since I was sort of talking about that before. I think it is the point that you might take from what I was just saying is that it's definitely true that the interests of the PI and students or postdocs or other trainees in the lab may be somewhat different, and so that can require some navigation. If you're a postdoc, I think you're interested in really getting a story into a quote unquote high profile journal as readily as possible, just because of the inference and assumption that is necessary in order to get a faculty position. And there's some truth to that, and there's also some, that's also not entirely true. I would say that some people end up spending the bulk of their training getting a single story out into a high profile journal, which is good, but at the expense of maybe developing 3 or 4 other stories that the research program might have led to, and you might have ended up with a different publication record, maybe more publications if you had chosen to target stories to somewhat lower profile journals. It's a real balancing act, and there isn't a right answer. I do think it's true that some of the top departments will be looking at the whether a journal is super high profile or not. I don't think that's exclusive, but I don't want to dismiss that as a concern. I think the challenge in targeting a high profile journal is often that despite the efforts of the journals and the editors, the review process can be a real ordeal, and lead to considerable amount of time spent on shoring up a manuscript in a way that it's valuable for the story, but maybe not the best use of your time. So that's one of the definite drawbacks of high profile journal publishing. On the other hand, it means that your story will be seen by many more people, and that's certainly a good thing. I'll stop there and let Ronna pitch in.
Yeah, so this all good points, and I think that it's a real hard balance to strike. It starts with who's the person working on the project, right? Because at the end of the day, I mean, research is really important, but the people that are doing the research and their careers are at least equally, and I think more important. I mean, right, look how much money is spent on hearing research or cancer research, right? And we haven't cured it yet, but the people that are doing the research, they need to live their lives and move on and secure positions. And so when we think about a graduate student, right? The graduate student cannot graduate in most universities without a first author publication. And that first author publication does not have to be a high impact journal for them to graduate. Realistically, that first author publication would be something that they wrote start to finish. And it will be something that will give them the experience of putting together a peer-reviewed manuscript and going through the peer review process. And when I think about that for my students, I allocate a year. I mean, that someone, when they submit their paper, sometimes it will be just 3 months to the point of publication, but they should assume, in my opinion, that from the moment they submitted a paper, it's going to be a year before the paper is accepted. It might be shorter. And so it's just like Peter said, it's good to have 2 projects, because there is a project from graduate students, and this is true also for postdocs, realistically, because most postdocs, it's going to be very, very hard to secure a job with just 1 publication, even if that 1 publication was a monster paper and sell. I mean, it would require that type of 1 publication to secure a position would require some other things to alleviate the concerns of the people that will be hiring the postdoc, that they will be productive and successful in securing funding. So the path is to, in my opinion, to always think for every trainee of at least 2 publications. And one of them would be a smaller project, and the smaller project would be targeted to a smaller journal. And it may be that it is true that that higher impact journals have potentially a higher readership. But a lot of this, what we read right now is based on keyword searches. And so we find publications that are published also in lower impact journals. Usually what it does to the person that's reading the publication, it makes them more cautious maybe, and when they're reading the paper, because they know that the peer review process might have been more lenient, and there may be bigger holes in the story. I personally, in my first 10 years of being a PI, usually did not try to target high impact journals. I ended up a couple of times being extremely lucky, but as I was building the project, that was not the goal of the project. The goal was to try to do the best science I can, and then through conversations with colleagues that I sent a draft to try to figure out what's the better home for the paper. And colleagues will usually give you a pretty good idea of what your paper is capable of doing when it comes to publication, in my opinion. I think that the attempt to go for a Nature paper a priori can be really frustrating, frustrating for the mentor and frustrating for the mentee, because unless it starts off with an incredibly good idea that is backed up with incredibly amazing data, adding more and more experiments is usually not going to do the trick, but will generate this false expectation that maybe if we will work harder and we will stay 2 additional nights, or maybe skip 10 additional weekends of doing something socially, it will go into this imaginary, very high impact paper. But in my opinion, it's probably not that's not what makes a paper a high paper. It comes really down to what is the question that led to the paper, and then obviously there needs to be very strong data to back it up.
Another factor that I find important is, essentially what's the production quality of the journal. I mean, in my early career, I definitely targeted more high impact journals, I would say. And one of the interesting things is that as your career goes on, uh, the ability as time goes on, it's not necessarily your career, the number of submissions to each journal goes up faster than the number of slots that they have, and so the competition gets harder and harder. But another way of looking at that is that the sort of suite of selective and high quality journals continues to expand, and so you actually have more options than back when I started, when there would, we really would consider Science, Nature, or Cell as being the pinnacle. And now, as Ronna suggests, it's non-trivial. But the point I was starting to make was that I do find that some journals are much better about reproducing figures, most importantly, and at the size that you think are appropriate to get the message across. And then, and other journals, and many journals are better than others in terms of word limits, which allows you to tell your story the way you want it to. I mean, sometimes, I think things have changed. I mean, Nature papers are different from the way the typical Nature letter 20 years ago, or the typical Nature paper was a letter 20 years ago, and that's changed. But still, in many of the selective journals, they also have very severe word limits, and so you end up with a almost cryptic manuscript. It's very hard to decode because you have to really squeeze in a lot of information into a few words. And so I do find that it's my bias that if you want to write a paper for the ages, that you need to have the opportunity to display the data as you see fit, and also be able to explain it in such a way that it makes it more accessible to a wider number of people. So that's one of the reasons I have felt less concern in targeting maybe less selective journals over the years, just because I think that the finished product is going to be better in some journals than it would be in some of these other journals where you really have to squeeze things in.
Very nice points. Very informative. I think maybe we could go towards the idea of the change in our field of being able to upload to bioRxiv. Like, when do you think that's relevant? And then also, because we know bioRxiv isn't yet peer-reviewed papers, like, how do you think you view them as a reader, or like students should view them as a less informed reader?
That's a really good question. I am very much of two minds about this. I first of all, because NIH allows preprints to be cited in your list of publications for grant renewal, there's extra motivation for including a preprint there, even if you're, especially if the time to publication or acceptance is a ways off, and it's not going to necessarily make it in time for the grant review. I'm uncomfortable with that as a motivation, to tell you the truth, and I actually have changed my opinion to a degree on preprints. I do, just as a scientist, I look at them because I like to see what's coming out in the future. But I also recognize that that they are subject to significant change. Sometimes they change a lot, sometimes they don't, in the review process. And so I do take them with a grain of salt. I find, most of the time the preprints that I look at are relatively close to the final product that you see in the journal. But I worry that by focusing too much attention on preprints to the exclusion of the final product, we're missing the important aspect of reviewer input into the manuscript, and sometimes that's pretty significant. So, like I say, I'm of two minds.
bioarchive opened a lot of opportunities, right? In some sciences that are not biology, this is the way to publish your data, right? In mathematics or in other exact sciences. A lot of people share their findings that way. In biology, it's a little tricky for the reasons Peter said. And we have a lot of fun in the lab when a paper that is something that we're extremely curious about gets published in bioarchives to do a lab meeting about it, sort of like a journal club. And we take it very seriously. Normally we assume that this is close to the product, but we also are very cautious, and it's interesting to see what things change between the preprint and the actual manuscript when it gets published. So I think the bioarchives are, it's a great way for students to learn and for groups to have something to discuss. It's a great way for researchers to get a glimpse into the future, right? I mean, there's a lot of data that you want to see sometimes, and you would have had to wait maybe 8 months. There's some really great preprints that I've seen 3 or 4 years ago that I'm still waiting for the paper to get published, also so that the data will be completely freely shared. And then for students that move on and the project is maybe a less important project for the lab, and there's absolutely nobody to complete the project and bring it to a point of a better peer-reviewed publication. This is a way to resolute perhaps between the desires of the mentor and the desires of the mentee, the desires of the mentee to move on, and the desires of the mentor to make sure that every part of the work that was funded by donations or taxpayer money is actually shared with the research community at large. So this is a way to circumvent this 6 months to 1 year ordeal of getting something published, and just package it in a as respectful way as possible and put it out there so at least people are aware of the information, and the trainee has at least something to show, even if it's a preprint for their work.
Yeah, it's a really nice way to put it. How do you all moving like kind of through the stages of publication like to respond to reviewer comments, and how you deal with it if you disagree, kind of just the gambit?
You want to go first?
Sure. I usually read the critiques. And well, sometimes I don't even read the critiques, to be honest. Sometimes I get the critiques, I read the first 3 lines, and I decide if I want to read the rest of the email. And then I usually forward it to my team, the people that did the work, and I actually go and do something else, maybe for 3 days. Because I find it incredibly painful to read a bad critique. And and sometimes I will go as far as asking my team, what do they think about the critiques before I read them myself? And maybe a week later, I will actually read the email with the critiques. Because by the time you submit a paper, once you've answered everything that you need to do, right? That you went through draft 35 and the STAR methods and everything else that goes into it. The last thing you want is to read 4 pages of everything that someone thinks is wrong about what you've done. So I think the first hurdle for me, and I have not gotten better with it over the years, is just figuring out how to deal with it emotionally. And my easiest way of doing it is just making it go away. But once it's time to actually deal with it, then I try to understand where they're coming from. And I try to see what can we really address and what do we want to address. Because sometimes there are things that, even if they're addressable, we might not want to address. And then and then you just deal with it like anything else in life. You sort of you have to think very carefully and choose your battles. Peter.
Yeah, that it's interesting. I have a slightly different immediate reaction to the reviews because I instead immediately take the review, copy it from the email, paste it into a Word file, and start responding, but only to the things that I can respond to immediately that I know, that we can address. So I feel like it's not as, it's not 4 pages of things that are horrible that we can't deal with, but I break it down into things that we need to focus on. And I put them aside like you, but I do try and make some progress on the review. The other thing that I've done, and I think this is equally, if not, it's probably more important for grant reviews, is just to step back and say, yeah, this reviewer doesn't have things quite right. And they've misunderstood what we said in this paper, but that's on me. That's on us. That's not on them. And that's kind of my attitude, is that we did not explain something correctly. I mean, there are cases where there are true differences of opinion, and that's different. But when a reviewer seems to misunderstand what you're doing in the paper, that is your responsibility to fix that, so that they understand, that everybody understands it better. So even though the reviewer was way off base, think of that as actually an important lesson, that even though they're wrong, you're also at fault for not explaining things appropriately. But it is true. I mean, I must say that over my career, I have gotten it. It's a lot easier to take the reviews, even though they're not any better than they were 20 years ago. I have more equanimity in just looking at them and just sitting with them. I think the other facet that is important is that I think how you respond to the reviews does vary to some degree based on the journal and your intuition of what the journal editor is going to want. And so, at a quote unquote high impact journal, you may feel that it's really more important, and the editor may actually be quite explicit about this, that you respond to everything with experiments if necessary, even those comments that are going to lead to months of new experiments. And that's, you kind of have to do that, even in the case where you're not sure of the added value of those experiments. I think in other cases that you can make a reasoned case that you're not going to follow the recommendation of a reviewer, and this is why. I think it's reasonable to do, as long as you're taking the reviewers seriously and not saying, no way to every single suggestion they make. I think it's okay to make a case that a particular set of experiments doesn't add much or would be a tremendous amount of work and really, appropriate for a next paper in a series rather than this one. But this is one of the challenges, is kind of figuring out where that the balance is for each paper and each journal, and each editor and each reviewer. It is a bit different for everybody, and you don't always get it right. But I do think, though, that you really, while you should take all the reviewers' comments seriously, I think that in many cases, you can suggest that their concerns can be addressed in something different than the exact recommendation that they had.
I find that sometimes, it's funny enough, my best review experience has been with Nature, which I expected it to be the worst review experience, but they actually are willing to negotiate with you, and there is actually a respectful conversation between the corresponding author and the editor, which is really great. And whereas in most other journals, I feel like you get the review and you submit it to sort of like a black hole, and you wait to see what's going to come back. The other thing that we've done sometimes is generate data that is for the reviewers, but not necessarily for the manuscript. So let's say a reviewer comes back to you with a certain concern, right? If you wanted to add certain data to a manuscript, you would have to do it in 3 biological replicates per sex and all the significance and whatnot. But if you really don't think that experiment is going to lead to something significant, you can tell the reviewer, here, we tried it, once or twice, and this is why we didn't pursue this line that you're suggesting, and you're showing that this is something that you thought about before, and you add those images and experiments to your response, but they don't have, and oftentimes my experience has been that the reviewer would be satisfied about that specific point. But I will say that, I'm curious what Peter thinks, but definitely the very vast majority of the comments needs to be addressed if you want the reviewer to be satisfied.
Yeah, I think a good example is a recent paper of ours where we got 10 pages of comments from one reviewer, one from another, and one from another. The 10 pages worth of comments were good, and the reviewer actually knew what he was talking about. He or she was talking about, for sure, and was appropriately critical of some of the points in the manuscript, but it was a bit over the top in terms of just challenging everything in the paper. To be fair, it was a unusually long paper as well, with lots of data, so there was a lot to discuss. And my response in these reviews was, and this wasn't a tactical decision, just came out this way, is that it pretty much responded to every single comment from the 2 shorter reviews, including some new experiments. And with the long reviewer, the long-winded reviewer, if you will, we were a little more combative, I would say, because it was a calculated risk, but I felt like the reviewer was trying to turn our paper into something that we disagreed with. And so, that's a little more difficult situation, I would say, but it turned out okay. The other point, picking up on something you said, Ronna, about a better conversation with nature, is that, it's my position as a reviewer, that the effort I put into, well, it's not quite the effort, but the thoughtfulness I put into a review, a paper that gets submitted to Nature in our field, for example, needs to be something that's really going to change the way we think about a problem. It's not just a paper that's going to add to the scientific literature and be another cog in the works, or what have you. And so I take the reviews of those papers really seriously, and think hard about the experiments and the results to really understand what the author is driving at. I mean, it'd be nice if I did this to every single review that I did at all the time, but it's frankly challenging when you have a lot of reviews on your plates and other things to do, which is, by the way, why I rarely review these days, because I just don't have as much time for it as I used to. But I really try and I don't want to be harsh, inappropriately critical of paper that's submitted to Nature, but I really want to think it through and think through what are the things that would convince me that this paper really elevates to that level, whether it's Nature or some other journal. And so I think that in general, the reviewers at the high-profile journals may get a higher fraction of really thoughtful reviews that they can work with, even though they may be quite disparate. And so that, is maybe part of what underlies what Ronna is referring to.
There's a question in the chat box.
Yeah, there's a question in the chat on kind of to go with, I think, what you were already talking about, is how to deal with a reviewer's comments in a case that you don't think you need a particular experiment, but the reviewer strongly feels that you need that experiment or additional experiments to prove your hypothesis and conclusion. So
Yeah.
kind of like you're budding, just like
Well,
internal.
I would say, because of the limited number of rounds of review, you have limited opportunity to see how headbutting your reviewer is actually going to be. So it's a little challenging, because you have to infer from the review whether you take a particular comment to the extreme that the reviewer wants, and hopefully you can get some guidance from the editor. And I've actually found that sort of following up or reaffirming what Ronna says, is that a lot of times it's really valuable to have a conversation with the editor about which of the experiments that they would see as being important in order for them to feel comfortable in accepting the paper. Because if you get the editor on your side, and you do what the editor asks you to, sometimes the editor will accept your paper without, not always, but sometimes they'll not send it out to the reviewers. So even if a particular experiment you didn't do an experiment that a reviewer asked for, if you have that agreement with the editor, it may be really not a problem. So I don't do that in all cases. I actually do it relatively rarely, but every time I have talked to an editor about the reviews, I've actually found it incredibly valuable. And it allows us to really focus on the critical responses.
I'll add to that, if two reviewers want you to do a certain experiment.
Yeah.
There's essentially no way of getting out of it.
Agreed.
And if there's something that one person wants, and just like Peter gave in his example, you've satisfied everything else and the other reviews. Sometimes the editor will just get a fourth reviewer. And if that fourth reviewer will be completely satisfied, then they might just forego that one reviewer. I mean, in your example, Peter, someone that writes a 10-page review that's a little bit over the top, even for a long manuscript. So it's hard to imagine that there weren't some overly ambitious emotions involved with the writing. And I mean, just to write 10 pages is so much effort. And so most editors, right, and we're all also editors on journals, are reasonable people. And you see that 10-page review come in. Sometimes an editor would even say, we can talk about this review number 3 and separately in email, because it is so different from reviews number 1 and 2. Or even before they send it, they'll send it to a fourth review, and you'll see that your manuscript comes back with 4 reviews, and that's just after a really long period of time of waiting for the reviews. And that's just because one of the reviews that came back just seemed so different from the other reviews.
To say thank you. I feel like there's a difference that I've seen in my short experience between people that are able to publish more papers and then people that publish less, and kind of like perfectionism. How do you battle, or like, I don't know if you ever struggled with it, the struggle to want to keep doing this experiment or answer every single question for a review and just kind of like really draw out the paper and the length of publication?
That's a really good question. And I think, I mean, I have, Ronna probably does too, but I have a variety of papers in different states that I could have submitted a long time ago, but want to see more on. To a degree, it does depend on who the person is, who's the primary driver, the first author, first and second authors, or whoever, what their needs are. So, for example, with a recent paper from a graduate student who was looking to graduate, I was less inclined to just keep looking, to get all the extra data to make this into the next level of story, because it was really in her best interest to get the paper published in a solid journal sooner rather than later. And then there are other stories in the lab where we get 3/4 of the way and see that we've got something interesting, but realize that it's going to take quite a bit of work to make it into not just a paper for a high impact factor journal, but just what I would consider a quality paper that addresses all the holes that we have in our story. And me personally, one of the things that I've learned about myself, this is not necessarily a good thing, but I've corrected it, so that's a good thing, is that as a mentor, I tended to not really look at a story that was being developed by a postdoc or a student until we were writing that story. And once we started writing the story up, then it was much easier for me to say, oh God, we really need, this other construct, in parallel with the first one. And there's a bunch of other controls we need. So the process of writing where you're really and putting figures together, frankly, as well, that makes me, brings up a lot more things that we need to do. And if a student has been working on a project for 3 years and then they start writing it up, and then only then am I asking for these controls, that's a little frustrating for them, and it delays the project. And so what I've done over the years is gone to earlier and earlier writing, so that we're writing at a pretty early stage in a paper, even though we'll have some drafts that might sit for 6 months. But it helps me, and I think it helps the trainee also, prioritize what comes next. And that's not something I learned in my training. I just came to it eventually, and realized that it was a shortcoming of mine, just in the way I mentor, and that the correct way of addressing it was, like I say, writing early. And so by writing early, we are putting all the ducks in a row earlier than we would otherwise. And so I think we've overcome some of the what you're referring to.
That's a great strategy. I'm going to steal it or adopt it. It's I think, just like Peter said, it's a lot of it also depends on the student, right? There are going to be some students that come out of the lab and in 4 or 5 years they generated 4 to 7 papers, out of which 1 or 2 are absolutely fantastic. And there are going to be students that come out of the lab and after 4 years they've generated maybe 1 paper and it's not the strongest paper. And you need to know what you can ask a person to do and remain, respectful of them and not and so I think there's a little bit of an art of matching a project to a person, right? And sometimes if you think very strongly as a mentor that this project is going to have to be a crown jewel, it might have to sort of started with the wrong person. It might become their secondary project that will get completed by someone else. That person needs to be given a project that is a better match for their interests and abilities and pace. Because at the end of the day, everyone needs to be happy, right? And you can't take something that you feel very strongly about developing the idea and how important it could be, and just sort of completely give it up just because the person that started working on it might not take it through to the same level. So there's a little bit of a give and take, I believe.
I 1000% agree with that comment, and it's something, again, I had to learn as a junior faculty member, that even though I had a lot of ideas and my big ideas, I tried to, I gave to various people, and you have to figure out the right project for each person. And what can happen is that if a great idea can get lost in the lab for a long time, I mean 10 years or more, because not only was it a good poor match to a given trainee, but then the lore in the lab is, oh, that's an impossible project, don't do that project even if Peter tells you to. And so nobody is really willing to pick it up until basically everybody's forgotten the stories. And that's okay, because you should always have lots of other ideas that you can come up with. But but I think it's so true that matching the project to the person is critical. And it goes in with the point that everybody should have multiple projects. And you know, you are trying out a number of different things, and also be willing to you know, as a trainee, be willing to give up a project, as a mentor, be willing to say, okay, we've got to shelve this one for now, and you work on something else. I mean, I did learn that as a postdoc, because I had a spectacular project. It was really cool, and it ran into a roadblock, and I put it aside. It's still in the freezer, you know, whatever that is, you know, 30 years later. I'd love to go back to it, but we ended up doing other things, and my career was not dependent on it. And so again, you know, people can come into the lab thinking that they want to shoot the moon with a particular experiment, and if it just isn't the right experiment for them, then it's critical that both that person gives it up and the mentor advises you know, a switch of projects. I see there's another comment in the chat.
Yeah, there's a comment in the chat. But I feel like maybe one question to piggyback on what you just said first, maybe, is like, how often do you feel like a project is a bad fit for a student? Or like, how often is this happening? And like, I feel like from my experience, it's really hard to get a graduate student to give up a project. And just, I mean, this might be like less of a publishing question, but like, if it's a bad match, kind of,
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I you know, thinking back to my students, my very first student worked on one project for 3 years, and we decided to switch projects, and that second project rolled along really quickly, and she got a really nice paper out of it, and everything was, you know, really fine, basically. And what she had been working on before got set aside, and it's still set aside. It really was a tricky project. Other students have not required that. Uh, what I find, what I found both as in the lab myself, and also having trainees, is that fully giving up a project is perhaps relatively rare. It's more likely that you put a project on a shelf for a period of time. It might be 2 weeks, might be 2 months, might be 2 years. And if you have another viable project, that's okay. And sometimes then coming back to that project that had been put aside, even if there's no new data in the lab that would inform that project, you know, both you as a mentor or you as a trainee are approaching it differently, and it starts working. And I've seen that multiple times. So I agree that by and large, students are not willing to give up a project. I think it's true too that students oftentimes are less willing to have two major viable projects, because they rightfully think that it's dividing their attention. It's true, it is. But I think because the roadblocks can come at any point in a project, it's just wise to be ready to put something aside, potentially for a very long time.
I'll get to the questions in the chat. It says, do you have strategies for when you want feedback beyond your team, but before you want to submit to a publication? Is this something a preprint could accomplish?
You want to tackle that first, Ronna?
Sure. I'm trying to understand the question.
I think the
I
question is,
mean, yeah, so I don't think a preprint is the way to get feedback.
I don't either.
It's, this is what colleagues are for. And most of us have trusted colleagues. I recently transitioned to the NIDCD. At the NIDCD, we cannot submit a paper for publication before it was critically reviewed by two people that have absolutely nothing to do with the project, and we addressed their concerns. And if they didn't give enough feedback, then you should go for trusted colleagues. I have in the past when I've even reached out to people that you could maybe consider as competitors on certain things when I really needed additional thought processes.
Yeah, I agree. I think that a lot of us PIs have a small number of colleagues that we really resonate with on a scientific level as well as personal level, and we're willing to share, pretty much everything that we're doing, even if it's somewhat. I mean, so I have a couple of colleagues who sometimes I publish with. More often, I just talk with about our projects. We have actually gone to the point of having meetings, either just PIs or PIs plus a number of trainees in interesting places. Like we went to Joshua Tree National Monument a couple of times and just had an opportunity to talk about projects that were fairly advanced, but not yet ready for publication. And so, the trainees or the PIs presented data and we discussed them as a large group. And that was really great. That's an unusual situation though. But those same colleagues can be the person to, send an early draft of a paper to, or just, have a Zoom call and go through some figures with them just to get their feedback. I would say that I don't do that often, but I don't think there's any downside in doing that. I think by and large, you're going to make the paper better because even if you can have a discussion about the concerns that somebody has. It's not at arm's length or further like it is with a reviewer. So you can have a give and take, and that can be really, really valuable. But I agree with Ronna that preprint is not the way to go, at least the way we handle preprints in the field these days. I think if you're not sure that a story is ready enough to submit it to a journal soon, then I'm not sure that it's ready to submit as a preprint. That's just my opinion. I don't like the idea of using a preprint to test the waters, if you will. But I'm maybe a little conservative about this, but I would see the preprint as just serving more as a advance warning of a story that you are trying to shepherd through the publication process.
I think possibly this question could have been like rooted a little bit in the fear of getting scooped if you share your data without the firmness of a preprint saying that it's yours. Maybe like how would you, because I know some people that are very cryptic about what they'll share. Like how do you kind of navigate the field of people being cryptic and like the fear of being scooped?
I mean, it's a good question. I prefer to have people working on things that are not competitive, because we've got such a different perspective on things or different set of tools or what have you, so that we don't have to worry about that this much. That's not always going to be the case. Sometimes, a project develops into something that turns out there's probably a couple other labs working on it as well. And that's when, you know, you need to feel like you've got trust in whoever you're sharing with. I think that's something that PIs probably can gauge because we've known people in our field for a long time. You know, I think it would be better for the PI that rather than the trainee to make that determination. And I also think that if you're concerned that there might be an overlap, I wouldn't just start off by sending them the draft of the paper, but instead feel out that the person you're asking for feedback from to make sure that they're not working on something that's broadly similar. It's tricky though.
So something that we do in our lab is when we're getting maybe a month before submission, we have the paper is sent to the entire lab for review. And you know, a lab is not a homogeneous animal. A lab has postbacks that just started a week ago, and it has staff scientists that sometimes have more years of experience in research than a PI. And it's a very heterogeneous group of people. And it generates an absolute mountain of comments, particularly if you develop in the lab a culture of please speak up and just respectful, constructive criticism. It's a colossal headache for the person that wrote the paper, because it's really a lot to take in, and sometimes, you know, you might not want to take in everything. Sometimes the comments are not even completely aligned with what the PI thinks, but it's a great learning tool. It really opens your eyes to how people with different backgrounds and levels of expertise see the paper. It shows you what others that are maybe doing something else in the lab misunderstand, because you're not writing something well, or you're not explaining something well enough. And it's always better to get constructive or even destructive criticism from your friends than from a reviewer. So we don't, nothing comes out of the lab, even to a close collaborator before the lab vetted it. And so this is a tool that we use and we find helpful.
Yeah, it's really a good idea, I think. We have another question in the chat, and it's for early career researchers, specifically those seeking transitional awards or other first funding sources. How do you recommend they balance between the two goals of accumulating data to get a high impact journal publication versus publishing in smaller chunks and getting lots of smaller impact publications to, like, you know, get their footing as a PI or like for their first academic job or something?
Yeah, I'm happy to start with this. I think Peter will have more experience, so it's beyond I think the question there is beyond just the impact, right? It's the completeness of your story, right? You need to have solid stories. So you might decide to break a project down into 2 papers, but the 2 papers need to be really good papers, even if they're not going into higher impact journals. And they have to balance it with how much time you're willing to be in the lab longer. Are you in a hurry to leave? And how serious you are about your position as a researcher. So I don't think there is a really good answer that I can provide. I'm curious, Peter, if you have some magic solutions.
I don't have a magic solution, but I do have something of a bias, which is that if you are looking to establish yourself in the field, then it's really important that you have an overarching research program in mind that goes beyond a given project that you're working on. For me, characterizing hair cell transduction is a big one, but that is bigger than the individual projects that I carried out as a postdoc that led to me getting a job and developing my career. So, I think that in my mind, you can just put all your effort into a single high profile paper that is on an important topic. That's great. And it certainly would be valuable. But as somebody who's evaluating a potential new assistant professor or evaluating whether somebody should get an early career award, a foundation award, or whatever, what I'll really be looking for is, what is that overarching goal in the research program that not only encompasses, the project, a couple of projects that you did as a postdoc, but also is fruitful for the future. And you can tell as, evaluating based on the output of the postdoc, but also on your knowledge of the field, that this is going to be an area where somebody could be productive. So I do think that it can be valuable to see that somebody has been able to publish 2 or 3 or even more papers that are not necessarily part of the same story, but they're related stories, or they're stories in the same area, because you can see then that they're moving towards a research program for the future. And I do think, this is not anything I did when I was a postdoc, but I do think that it's worthwhile probably thinking relatively early and writing relatively early in your postdoctoral career what, if you're applying for a Pew or a Searle fellowship where they want to see a cohesive research program, write that down. What's your research program going to be? You are going to need to do that in applying for jobs too, but having thought that through a few years in advance will help guide the choices you make for writing papers and publishing, as well as set you up for the next step in your career.
That sounds good. I have a couple more questions we could go through again towards the tail end of our time talking. So if you have any questions as like a participant, please put them in the chat so we could get to them before time ends. But in the meantime, how do you deal with authorship disputes in your lab?
I can start on that. It's the ideal answer is, we figure out what the authorship should be before the project starts, but that's not realistic because projects morph as time goes on, and somebody's role may change pretty significantly over time. I would say that I haven't had very many authorship disputes in my lab. I try to anticipate where there might, I think the biggest issue really ends up being, of course, who's going to be the first author on a paper, and whether there would be somebody who would be in the role of starred first author, but second in the order, or even third. I find that within the lab, it's easier to manage who goes where in a paper. By and large, there is a clear person who is the head of the project, the postdoc or student, or in my case, staff scientist, who really is driving the project, and they're going to be the first author. And then sometimes there can be a question of whether there needs to be a starred first author or not. That tends to be the bigger issue. So it's trickier when it comes to collaborations with multiple labs, because you're going to be managing the trainees' desire to be first author, for example, but also the PI's desire to be in the last author position. And so, I think that it's important. I mean, I think for PIs, it's really important to be advocating for your trainee as much as possible, and not, for example, not give up the opportunity to have a trainee in a coveted spot because you want to be the senior PI, even though that would be good for your career. That's a little more tricky than the authorship disputes within the lab, which are, like I say, easier. So, I think that as a PI, and frankly, as a trainee, you should be asking these questions. Talking about it at multiple stages of a project is a good thing. And to be honest, as I think about it now, one of the advantages of starting off with a very early draft of a paper is you put on paper. I mean, I don't just put the start with the abstract, but I start with the title. Actually, I think that's the most important thing to start with, but then the authors. And so you have a point where you can have a discussion with people in your lab, or maybe your collaborators as well. Is this the right author order? But then as time goes on, things may change, and I think you have to be willing to make changes because a project has morphed and now is something that is somebody else is equally important on, or maybe even superseded the first person. And that can be a little tricky, but like I say, I've had relatively few real problems with that.
So I generally speaking agree. I mean, there is this sort of rule, if you want, right? That if you did the work and you wrote the paper, you should be first author. But sometimes you did a work and you wrote the paper and paper gets submitted and the reviews come back, and then someone else is working on it for 2 more years.
Yeah.
And you moved on, and then I think that's the most classic example I can think about of then who's the first author. And so then it comes down to, well, you can have co-first author, right? But then who's the first author, right? And the most strict people will say, well, it doesn't matter who's the first author, and the people that are really strict, when they cite people with co-first authorship, they won't say, Gillespie et al. They will say Gillespie and Hertzano et al. Because if there are two first co-authors, that's one example. Certainly being part of collaborations where there has been sharing of who's going to be the last author and who's going to be the first author, and sort of give and take there. And in my experience, it's usually being that, let's say it's a collaboration between 2 labs. And it was a lab that started the project. And it's a PhD, for example, of that student. And that student, and your lab comes in and they might have contributed a huge amount. The first author, in my opinion, still needs to be the student from the other lab. That's their PhD, and that's their intellectual property. Your lab might have contributed some things that are very valuable, and it might have taken even 2 or 3 years of work of a student in your lab. In that case, first co-authorship is appropriate. But the person that this is their primary project, this is how they define themselves scientifically in a given period of time. And if they also wrote the first draft, I think they should be the first author.
I would just add to that. I completely agree with Ronna. I would add to that that in my other role as chief research officer, I certainly see there are lots of PIs who have less principled, in my mind, views of authorship and can take or give authorship for reasons that are not appropriate. And this is something that's pretty serious, and each institution does have or should have somebody in administration who is responsible for authorship disputes. And hopefully, none of this will ever happen to any of you, but there are PIs who egregiously violate the norms, and at times sometimes that may need to be addressed beyond the lab.
Yeah, that's unfortunate, but good information for anyone struggling. Maybe we can end on a happier note of how do you decide if you want your paper to be open access or not at the end? Like,
I mean, I think you always want it to be open access.
I mean, what if you don't have very much money,
So there's green open access, right? And there's regular open access. And I mean, ultimately, all papers are going to be open access in most journals. It just might have to wait a year, right? The amount of money that some journals ask in order to make a paper sort of like gold open access, so open access from the moment you publish, is absolutely illogical. And having said that, there are some funding agencies that mandate that you make your work open access from the moment it gets published. So I'm curious if Peter has better solutions, but I usually just budget money for it, and sometimes it takes away a big chunk of our budget. But I find it very hard to work around not making it open access.
Yeah, I would say that I have it's not the first thing I think about when I'm choosing a journal or choosing how I'm submitting, but it's up there. It's one of the top things. And I think that I have tended to go more towards open access journals than not recently. But again, it isn't the very first thing that I think about. And like Ronna points out, it can be quite expensive, which drains away resources that could be used for something else as well. I think that even probably more important than open access per se is the data availability, particularly as we go into the future. And that's something that I've thought about a lot more recently. So even with a paper that is initially behind a paywall, I really think hard about how the information, particularly all the supporting data, are going to be shared. And for people who have immediate access, they have immediate access. But for a paper to have some longevity, then for in this day and age, I think having the data be available as soon as possible is really important. Now that said, Ronna and I were having a little discussion by email before this because I have some proteomics data that frankly has been in. I think there are better ways of sharing data, and Ronna is the expert on this in our field for sure, because the gear portal for looking at inner ear data is fabulous. And I was just going to say that I've had these mass spectrometry data that for a long time that are available on journal websites as spreadsheets, but are not easily accessible by everybody using a tool like Gear. And I think that's wrong. I think that making sure that the data are easily accessible by everybody sooner rather than later is important. And that brings up the NIH's push for much broader data availability, and it's a much more stringent requirements in grant submissions now that are going to lead to really having to come up with solutions so that data are broadly available. So it's a little bit different question than you initially brought up around open access, but I do think that data access is something that is really important.
And it's really very much work in progress, right? Because right, that if the NIH new data mandate, if you read it for what it's worth, you need to share everything, right? So if you had 1,000 ADRs on a project with all the different mice and the different time points and whatnot, you need to share every single trace of every single ADR. And then you need to share, if you've counted synapses, and you've had, 500 focal images that you analyze to generate your graphs, you need to share every single image of the confocal that you generated with all the metadata. It adds up to be not inexpensive, also with regards to the repositories. And it adds up, even more importantly, to be time intensive in uploading the data to their repositories.
And generating the metadata and writing up the metadata.
Right. And then there's a question of, right, what repository would be the most accessible for people to actually work with once they want to get access to your data. So these are all things that are on the up and up and very positive. But right now, we're really learning how to do that, because it's very funny. It used to be that sharing genomic data was really challenging, right? And now the easiest, when I look at a paper that we're submitting, the easiest thing to share is the genomic data. How do you share everything else? And where do you upload everything else? And how do you deal with it? That's actually the harder part of data sharing.
Yeah, that was really nice. I feel like that was, the goal of publishing is to share your story with the world. So the news stories kind of underlie with being able to share lots of data. It's a really positive way to end here, about 5 minutes early. Don't think we really have time for another in-depth question. So thank everyone for attending, especially thank Dr. Hertzano and Dr. Barr-Gillespie for their time and their really good and valuable insights on publishing and writing.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
So we'll let you go and we'll hopefully end the recording.
Bye-bye.